Okay, these are your homework notes. These are on the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation lasted from 1300 to 1570. Okay, so to define the two main terms in the title of this, to protest means to express strong objection, while reform means to improve by correcting errors. So there were problems in the church that people wanted to reform. There were two of them mainly, and these were corruption and political conflict. We'll start off with corruption. The church raised money through practices like simony and the selling of indulgences. Now we'll talk more about selling indulgences, but simony is the practice of selling church offices. So if somebody said, "Hey, I want to be bishop," and then another person said, "Well, I want to be bishop too," the person that would become bishop would be the person who had the most money to pay for the office of bishop. Now, indulgences. Indulgences were things that were bought to help people get to heaven quicker, to keep them from not going to hell. They didn't have to go to purgatory, which in the Catholic Church is this belief where you go to wait between death and heaven or hell to figure out where you're going to go to, or you get through purgatory faster. Essentially, these were also fundraisers for the church. The church used these to sell indulgences, to raise money to help build new buildings, pay priests, and do not pass go, which is of course a reference to monopoly. Political conflict. You had kings and queens and popes. Um, During this time, many governments, as we've talked about before in class, were controlled by the church. So kings and queens often had conflicts with the pope, which the pope had the final rule. Um, Also, at this time, there were issues going on within the Catholic Church where there were more more than one pope, which is very odd. There were three living popes at one time, which is different to our present situation in 2014, where we have two living popes at one time, where one has resigned and one has taken office. These all three of these popes were acting as pope at the time they were pope. So there were calls for reform in the church by many. John Wycliffe questioned the authority of the pope. Why should the pope have the final say so? John Huss criticized the vast wealth of the church. So we have all these fundraisers. What are we doing with this money? You have all this money. And Desiderius Erasmus attacked corruption in the church. So there were calls for reforms long before stuff actually started to happen. And of course, as we've talked about before in class, the church didn't like what you did. They would treat you like you were a prisoner like they did Galileo Galilei. So Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther looked for reforms. Martin Luther criticized church practices like selling indulgences. That's one big thing he did. He criticized the practice of selling indulgences, which was a big thing at that time. He wanted to begin a discussion within the church about the true path to salvation. So during this time, the church believed that you shouldn't read the Bible, that parishioners or people that went to church were not the ones meant to read the Bible. You were meant to go to your priest and have them interpret the Bible for you. He nailed his 95 theses or arguments to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral for all to see. Many movies today will portray this as him nailing it to the door, and people came around to read it as if it was in German where Martin Luther lived at. He lived in Germany. However, if people went around to see what he was nailing to the door, they probably couldn't read it because it was in Latin. So, Protestant teaching. This is the teaching that was come up with after Martin Luther started his movement to reform the church. So justification by faith alone. He said the Bible is the only source of truth. So not your priest, but the Bible. He wanted people to be able to read and understand the Bible for themselves instead of having to go to their priest for him to interpret it for them. And salvation comes only through faith in Christ, not through faith in the church, not through indulgences, but only through faith in Christ. So excommunication, as we talked about before, people get kicked out of the church or imprisoned. This is what happened to Luther. So Pope Leo X demanded that Luther recant 41 of his 95 theses. So 90 out of the 95 things he argued he changed within the church, Pope Leo X wanted him to say, please forgive me for 41 of these. Luther was brought before the diet of worms. We're not talking about people actually sitting down and eating worms, but we're more so talking about a meeting in a town called Worms. So the diet is considered the group of people that he was brought before. And on January 1521, Luther was excommunicated from the church. He was kicked out of the Catholic Church. He would not recant 41 of his 95 theses. Also around the same time, as we talked about in class, the printing press came out. So Luther's ideas spread quickly with the help of the printing press. Luther's supporters distributed copies of his speeches and essays far and wide so everyone could read them and everyone could get to know that there was another choice coming out in the world. And so millions of people sided with Luther against the Roman Catholic Church. So he created a new church. Luther soon had many followers. His supporters began to organize a new Christian denomination, which is now known as the Lutheran Church. Several German princes supported Luther. Lutherans and Catholics fought each other, which is here in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. And the first wars ended with the Treaty of Augsburg, but fighting in Europe over religion continued into the mid-17th century. So people fought for a while over religion. So for Lutheranism, Luther's followers disagreed with many of the teachings of the Catholic Church. They rejected the authority of the church councils and the Pope. And reading the Bible was the only way to learn how to lead a good life. As you see here, Luther had a Bible translated into German, and with the help of the printing press, German Bibles were spread widely throughout Germany and Germanic-speaking countries. Reformation spread to other countries with other leaders. France and Switzerland had John Calvin, who preached the idea of predestination, that some people had been chosen by God for salvation from the beginning of time. So he believed that no matter what you did within your life, that God had already decided that whether or not you were going to go to heaven or hell simply from the beginning of time. And in England, King Henry VIII refused to recognize the Roman Catholic Church and started a new church, the Church of England. He started the new Church of England because he wanted to get a divorce, and in the Catholic Church, that's against the law. And he said, forget all of you, I'm getting divorced, and I'm starting a new church. That's the end.